Just to say that if you are enjoying this podcast and you'd like to give us a bit of extra support, you can head over to our Support Us page where you can give us a tip, or you can follow us on Patreon and you can download our newsletter. And we really appreciate everybody who gives us a bit of extra support there.
The fact that the truth really can come out during a courtroom procedure is so important. And the acknowledgement that things go wrong, the acknowledgement that rules were violated. And that is, apart from compensation, that is the most important thing.
No one can act with impunity.
These are crimes that are beyond the pale.
We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about numbers.
We need a court. That's as simple as that.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg.
All rise.
Hi, Steph.
Hi, Janet.
So, I missed a party last month that I was invited to, so I'm going to make a podcast instead.
Yeah, I also didn't make it to the party. I don't know what it was. I was invited, but, life keeps happening to me. So I guess I didn't make it either. So tell me, what is the podcast you did?
Well, the party to commemorate the official stepping down by Frederiek de Vlaming from the helm of the Nuhanovic Foundation after many years. If you're Dutch, you'll know quite a few of their major pieces of work which have involved challenging the Dutch state to accept responsibility for the effects of particularly its military activities and to provide compensation for Dutch war crimes victims. So before we get into the interview, I'm going to do a quick pop quiz here. No preparation, Steph. Is that okay?
That is fine.
And it's about all the various cases that the Nuhanovic Foundation has been involved in. So, starter for one, the Nuhanovic-Mustovic case. When you have to describe that to people, Steph, what do you say? What was it about?
It was about the failure of Dutch UN blue helmets to protect people in their employ at the UN base in Srebrenica, Bosnia. Some of their employees who were working on the Dutch base got killed in the Srebrenica massacre, in which 8,000 mainly Muslim men and boys were killed after Bosnian Serb forces overran the enclave in 1995. And Nuhanovic is the name of the translator of Dutch Bat, the Dutch battalion, whose brother and parents were taken by Bosnian Serb soldiers and killed. And Alma Mustafic, or the Mustafic name, is the father of Alma Mustafic, who we have had on the podcast. He was an electrician on the base and was also handed over to Bosnian Serb troops and didn't survive. And we've had a podcast with Alma about the movie about Srebrenica massacre called Quo Vadis Aida.
And also about Alma's work explaining and engaging with people. I mean, she's very big on education and how this is such an important thing for Dutch people to remember forever and ever, which I think is going to chime with the theme of the podcast. But let's keep on with the quiz for you. Next one to try out with you. There was something about colonial crimes, Dutch colonial crimes in Indonesia.
Yes, this is after the Second World War. Dutch had Indonesia as a colony and weren't quite prepared to let it go after the Second World War. And what happened afterwards we call in Dutch still police actions, but was actually a war fought against Indonesians who were fighting against independence. And there were some very notable atrocities of Dutch soldiers essentially murdering villages. And this case was the widows of some of the people who were killed in these police actions sued the Dutch state.
And another one, here we go, another two, let's say, together. Dutch forces abroad. First one, Hawija, that's Iraq. Another one, Chora or Kora, that's a place in Afghanistan. What were those ones about?
The Hawija one was about Dutch F-16 fighter planes bombing an alleged ISIS bomb factory, but the explosion was much larger than expected and it took out half of a neighborhood close to it, about 70, I think, civilian casualties. And then for a long time, the Dutch government said there were no civilian casualties, even though Reuters reported the next day that there were probably upwards of 70 victims, and that in the end bore out to be true, but the Dutch command kind of suggested that there weren't any casualties, and the people of Hawija have filed a case with the Dutch state, and I think they're now negotiating about compensation, and there's been a parliamentary inquiry into the circumstances. The Chora Afghanistan case was another where the Dutch were part of the international forces in Afghanistan who bombed a village near their base, and the court case was that they had illegally did not comply with international humanitarian law by bombing these civilian dwellings and causing victims. And eventually, I think the judge agreed that this was against international war rules because it wasn't clear that there were actually attacks coming from that particular village or those particular buildings, and they bombed them with heavy artillery for almost a full day.
Finally, I think there are others along the way, but big ones that we've had some connection to and maybe covered in different ways. There's a Palestinian case known as the Ziada case.
Now I have to really dig deep, but I've been at this case. So this is a Dutch Palestinian man whose family compound was, I think, there was an explosion in his family compound by Israeli military, and he had tried to bring a case against the commanders of the army who made that decision, but that was thrown out in the end because of functional immunity of the army leader. So the Dutch judge said that he couldn't go after Israeli officials for what they did in their job as army officials.
And that case, I think, as Frederiek says, is at the European Court of Human Rights now. And the other name that we need to mention in association with Frederiek is, of course, Liesbeth Zegveld. So tell us about her, Steph.
Yes, she is the Dutch human rights lawyer. I've been avoiding naming her, but essentially these are all Zegveld cases. The Srebrenica mothers case, the Indonesia crimes, the Hawija and the Chora case are all done by Liesbeth Zegveld, who is specialized in kind of bringing cases for victims against the Dutch state. And it took many, many years to get the Srebrenica case heard, but she eventually won. And so ever since, and she's won other cases with it as well, so ever since whenever we hear that Liesbeth Zegveld is doing a case, we are all kind of paying a little more attention and showing up at these things that seem like a long shot. But with Liesbeth Zegveld doing it, you never quite know. I mean, you can't count on it being dismissed. So she is a kind of absolute bulwark of having these kind of strategic litigations in Dutch courts, especially civil lawsuits. So it's not criminal cases, but civil cases where she's trying to get compensation and recognition for victims.
And we have, of course, a podcast that we did with Liesbeth way back in the day, so we'll definitely put a link into that. So as Frederiek is moving on from the Nuhanovic Foundation, and they've been, instrumental in making these particular strategic litigation cases happen, I thought it would be interesting to have a chat to her. So I did that a couple of weeks ago, and I asked her to tell us whether strategic litigation is still alive and kicking. Hi, Frederiek.
Hi. Good to see and hear you. I can see you. The listeners hear us. Yeah, it's good to be in touch again.
Tell me, just to start with, if you can think back to the late 2000s, I suppose, sort of the beginning of the century, you must have had this idea that strategic litigation was needed, and you ended up establishing the Nuhanovic Foundation in 2011. What was in your mind? Why was it actually needed at that point?
Well, to be honest, and to be very fair to Liesbeth Zegveld, she was the one who founded it, because she was the one who did the Nuhanovic case. We will discuss this case. This was a very important case that made her realize that these cases are important, that really can change things, but that these take up a lot of energy, a lot of resources, a lot of money, time, and that you need a network and an organization that is supporting those kind of cases, whether it's financially or whether it's to provide for a professional and also a social network to the people who who go to court and go through this immense project. I mean, it is a project for everybody, but for the claimants, it's more than a going to court. I mean, it costs you 10 years of your life. In the past 12 years, I've seen people go through this process. And I would love to discuss a little bit what that means for people who go to court. We see them in court for a couple of hours or maybe for 2 days, but what an impact that has on their lives. And I think you need a social structure to support people.
Okay, well, let's come back to that. Why don't you just remind us what that original case was about, why it was so important in the Netherlands, because it was about essentially the Dutch role in Srebrenica.
Yeah, well, it was the first time, and I think we support cases that in one way or the other are innovative. So this case was absolutely a first case in its kind, as it questioned the responsibility of a member of a peace coalition, an international coalition, dealing with a war situation. You had the UN established presence in Bosnia, and things went wrong. And what the lawyers and the claimants in this Nuhanovic case asked, how do we organize the responsibility if things go wrong? Well, we all know Srebrenica went wrong. There were thousands of people killed. And of course, the perpetrator, we all know were the Serbs or the Bosnian Serbs. But there was also a problem with the attitude and the governance or the behavior of the UN battalion of the Dutch, the so-called Dutch Bat, who made all sorts of decisions on the ground that led to the death of a number of people. And the people that were involved, like Hassan Nuhanovic, who was the interpreter for Dutch Bat, who was there, a very clever man, a lawyer himself, very good in English, studied this whole situation and said, I want to know how, in international law, how that's regulated, the responsibility of members of international coalitions that are there to protect people. And then things go wrong, and who's responsible? So in that sense, that was the first time that question was put on the table. And that didn't come from me. I mean, that's Liesbeth Zegveld's achievement.
You make it sound very kind of highfalutin, very we want to answer a question in international law. I mean, is it always so noble?
Well, the cases that we are concerned with, yeah, I think it's noble because it is about how to really protect civilians in a war zone. Because we all know that international humanitarian law is there to protect civilians, right? Non-combatants. But how that really works still has to be decided in many aspects, has to be decided by the judge. And that's why I say we support cases that are innovative, because there are still a lot of questions. And maybe we can talk about the other cases that Liesbeth Zegveld did, like, for example, the case against the Dutch state for its bombing targets in Iraq, in Hawija. That's also about the question, how are things arranged in this part of international law? When you, as a civilian, you're targeted, you're bombed, where do you go? On what door do you knock to get your reparations? Because it's a soft law. You have the right to reparations if you're a victim of a war crime. But then where do you go? And I think that makes sense to sort of find the trajectory where you have to go as a victim of war crimes. I mean, because it's always an international thing. There are always many players. There are coalitions. There are governments. There are armies. And the whole law is directed at protection of civilians, but then things go wrong, and then where do you go? I mean, this is what Liesbeth always says. Huh? What loket do you, what door do you knock to get reparations? In whatever form, right?
You've already mentioned these things take a lot of time. I assume that they take a lot of money. Why do they take so long, and why do they cost so much?
Well, why do they take so long? Because most of these cases that we supported were against the Dutch government. The Dutch government really is a champion in not wanting to sit around the table and say, okay, let's let's face it, what happened, what went wrong, where is our responsibility, and how can we talk to each other and how the Dutch government is so bad at that. And we have seen that in the cases against the Dutch state for the colonial crimes in Indonesia, that there was sort of unwillingness to discuss the responsibility of killings by the Dutch government at that time. We've seen it in the case that I just mentioned against, the bombing of. I mean, it is not on purpose. It is things go many times I say it, things go wrong, and the Dutch are just not very good in acknowledging that things can go wrong on their side, and so you have to sit down with the victims, and that I find really amazing. I also see that in other fields that I work in the migration issues. There's a sort of stubbornness in the Dutch mentality at the government side that is huge. And I just read a couple of years ago, I read this book by David van der Rijbroek about our colonial past. And he discusses several studies comparing how colonial powers deal with their colonial past. And the Dutch are the worst in class. And you see that in the courtroom. You see, to just give you one example, in this case against the Dutch state for the colonial, for these killings in Indonesia, that the attitude of the lawyer for the Dutch state was so arrogant and so humiliating to the victims or the relatives of the victims who were there. Old Indonesian ladies who were there in the courtroom, trembling of cold and fear, and then still saying, well, it's a long time ago. There's just unnecessary, undecent behavior in a courtroom as an expression of that attitude.
Does it cost a huge amount of money? I mean, I can only imagine if something's going to take 10 years and you've got to keep on paying lawyers, then, the cost must mount up.
Well, I think that's one of the things that I would love one journalist or someone to figure out. For example, how much this Nuhanovic Mustafic case has costed up to the Supreme Court, because of course you have legal aid if your income is under a certain level, but it's millions because it's all these teams of lawyers are in the courts. So we have never calculated it. I think someone else should do that. And the Dutch government should sort of realize that they're throwing away money, because at the end of the day, most of these cases are won in courtroom, and then compensation has to be paid, which could have been done at the beginning. So it's a waste of money. Yeah, it's a lot of money. But most important is these attitudes that we have to fight.
Where does the Nuhanovic Foundation money come from? Does yours cost also millions?
We don't have millions. We're very small. We do a lot with very little money. If there are cases that claimants have to pay for themselves because they're not covered by legal aid, we do, like, for example, the Ismail Ziada case, which was the case by the Palestinian against the Israeli Defense Forces before a Dutch court. We're very, very exceptional. That we organized a crowdfunding thing. And that went extremely well because of the international network of Palestinians all over the world for a case that has not been seen anywhere else. I mean, it was the first time the Israeli Defense Force were asked to come to court. So interesting for all judges all over the world. So that went quite well. But as a foundation, no, we're not very rich, but we're very creative.
Do you have that sense that, the cases come to you, or do you pick the cases? Are you looking for a subject that where you need to, as you said before, answer a big question in international law, or because you see a big injustice going on? I mean, or I think some of the critics might suggest that it just looks like you're trying to pick a fight again and again with the Dutch authorities. I assume that you have a different way of seeing it.
Well, it's a Dutch organization, so we focus on cases that have a link with the Netherlands. That I think is the most important thing. And unfortunately, we have not been in a real position to pick cases ourselves. So we are approached by victims or claimants or lawyers or other organizations to support the cases that they do, and then we say yes or no. And again, like I said, we agree to support a case when we think this might change the law, this might change a policy, this might change the lives of more victims than the one or the few claimants that has taken up the case. So there are a number of criteria that play a role in deciding whether or not we support a case. And of course, my dream always has been to define and to formulate a policy so that we can pick our fights. But it's, I mean, we're in a sort of responsive mode up to now.
When you think about how it feels for the survivors to go through these long processes, I mean, what is it that people tell you? I can only imagine the incredible sort of strain it puts on survivors and the disappointment that many must feel in the end with whatever results they do get. Well, and sometimes they're completely let down.
I mean, why it's worthwhile to go to court for years and years and years is often comes back in one little hearing before a court where suddenly the truth appears on the table. And I remember when I studied the Yugoslavia Tribunal, these cases took years, but then on one Thursday afternoon, someone said the truth. And then there was a sort of, you probably also remember, among people in the public hall or among the victim communities, that this is what we're doing it for. That finally, and I think the Nuhanovic case also is a good example of that, that the judges kept on asking the Dutch military, how come you say that people on their own account left the Dutch compound? And that the Dutch kept on sort of lying, no, people left on their voluntary, and they left the compound because they thought it was safe or so. And then suddenly when I remember very well, one Dutch military said no. Well, when the judge said, come on, I just can't believe it. It's the end of the war. We all know the role of the Serbs. We all know how many people were killed. You sent people off the compound. You sort of know what would happen. And that thanks to these active judges, then these military say, okay, yes, it's true. No, they didn't go voluntary. They left because we told them, and then they were killed. And those moments later, like Hassan Nuhanovic said, those moments that's what you fight for 10 years. To hear those 3 sentences saying, you're right, we did wrong. And apparently, I mean, I'm not a victim and I have not been in their shoes, but apparently the fact that the truth really can come out during a courtroom procedure is so important. And the acknowledgement that things are wrong, the acknowledgement that rules were violated. And that is, apart from compensation that is the most important thing.
I was going to ask you about compensation or reparations. I mean, they can be, small amounts, but they can be really important symbolically, can't they? To say not only this is the truth, but we owe you something for it.
Yeah, I think I have never heard someone saying, I'm so happy with the money. There's this fantastic book written by Sliomovic, that she's an anthropologist. She comes from a family of Auschwitz survivors. And this is one of the best things about this topic, books about this topic, in which she describes all these members in her family who survived Auschwitz, and they all had a different idea about the meaning of money. Like, for example, her grandmother who survived Auschwitz, she said, I want to have every single penny that I can get out of the German government so they know that I still exist. So I'm applying for any compensation scheme that exists. So that's what she spent her whole life after Auschwitz. Her daughter, who also survived Auschwitz, she said, I don't want to touch any money from the Germans. I don't want to see it in my bank account because it reminds me, every month it arrives in my bank account. It reminds me of my dead father. There's blood on that money. I just don't want to receive it. And it's a beautiful study how different, what compensation and money means. Why? Because it depends who is giving you the money and for what reason. And was it because a judge told them to do it? Or was it because you said, no, I want to sort of express my regret and here is a certain amount. So in general, I mean, there's no one answer. But most people we worked with over the years were really not interested in money. And above that, I mean, the Indonesian victims who got money, that led to a lot of problems in Indonesia because some people got money, lots of money, and others didn't because they hadn't joined the litigation, and it led to a very awful situation in some of the villages.
And you suggested that somehow these processes end up with a version of truth that matters very much to survivors, victims. But is that, I mean, in looking at the bigger society, is that more important than working on reconciliation or making sure that there's some kind of agreed historical record?
Well, I guess the two are interconnected, because if you have the truth on the table, then you can start talking to each other. And the funny thing is that, for example, Alma Mustafic, who was also one of the claimants in the Nuhanovic case, after the case, she wrote a theater piece on what had happened. And she did that together with members of Dutchbat. And that was a piece of, I mean, that was an act of reconciliation. But that probably had not happened without the case. I don't know. But of course, the two are connected, because if you find at the end of the day, if you know better what really happened, and that's what's being brought to in the courtroom, what we have seen in the Havija case, for example. I mean, there were all these discussions in the Dutch parliament on about what happened really, and there was just not a single fact came out of those endless conversations in the parliament, because the Dutch government kept on saying we can't say this because the Americans this and that. So there I thought it was such a strong, I was so convinced that if you go to court, I mean, of course there's also a commission of inquiry, etc., but in the court there comes truth. The Havija case is very similar to another case that we support, and that's the Chora case. That was also about the bombardment by the Dutch in Afghanistan, where that is a fantastic example of how the truth came about during the court proceedings. Because that's there you had judges who said, okay, to the military, explain to us why you had to bomb this particular village. Because me as a lawyer, I don't know anything about this theater, this war theater. I'm a dummy, and you explain to me how this works, why it was 3 o'clock in the night, it was dark. How did you know that there were these Taliban people in the village that made you decide to bomb with an enormous violence, to bomb this really very small village? And I mean, was one of, for me, the most fascinating hearings in court in The Hague, where slowly, there was no answer to that, because there were other reasons to bomb, but not that there was a danger or there was a security issue for the Dutch or whatever. No, there were other things. And so the conclusion of the court was, well, we don't see any reason why you would have bombed that village. So the Dutch should pay compensation, because there was no real good reason to bomb. And I think, I mean, this is sort of by detailed analysis of the situation, minute by minute, hour by hour. What could they see? What could they hear? I mean, that's a beautiful function of law. Then really law is at work. I mean, of course, it doesn't work out all the time like that. But and Lisbeth Zegwaert is still negotiating, I think, the compensation with the Dutch government. But that's beautiful, because the military have sort of the attitude: listen, when it's war, it's up to us. We understand what the heat of the war, the fog of war, what it means. And don't ask us questions, because you will never understand. And there was this real debate between military and lawyers. It's fantastic.
It sounds a little like it's kind of a long stream of regular successes on behalf of the foundation. Maybe you could tell us the times when it hasn't worked out?
No, because I think Chora is an exception, that in the first instance, immediately the judges decided in favor of the claimants. That was not the case in all the other cases because the Dutch government appealed all these decisions. Like, for example, the case of Ismail Ziada, we just mentioned him, the Palestinian who went to court before a Dutch court because he says, in Israel, I have no access to justice. I cannot physically, legally, I cannot go to court. I don't have a fair chance in court. So there is this regulation in Dutch law that if you have no way to get justice where you come from, there is a possibility to go to a Dutch court. So he tried that, and there it was just the doors were so closed because the judges said, well, the Israeli military have immunity, and that was decided by the district court at the first instance, then by the appeals court, and then also by the Supreme Court. So now we are at the European Court on Human Rights. It's very difficult because this immunity thing is really very difficult to tackle. But it is also a question of courage of lawyers, because there is an opening. I mean, that is what the lawyers always argue. There is an opening. Look at the International Criminal Court. There is, what they have decided about immunity, if there are international crimes concerned, that should also be relevant in civil proceedings, because we talk about civil proceedings here, which is about establishing the responsibility of governments and not about punishing individuals.
Yeah, many of the courts that we deal with here on the podcast are to do with punishing individuals, and then there's some of the interstate courts as well, like the International Court of Justice. So, there are many, many different forms of justice. Do you think that there is still a role for the form of strategic litigation that you were championing for so many years? Is it still needed?
I think so. Yes, I definitely think so. Well, look at the whole Gaza case. I hope there will be. There are lots of court cases going on. We have not been involved actively or directly, but indirectly, yes. And I think these are hugely important that we use civil proceedings to get responsibility issues clear. So I think, yes, but more, we need it more and more and more, because we also see how vulnerable this international criminal system is, like the International Criminal Court. It's under so much attack. There are many problems about it. It's always about a small number of individuals. And I think civil proceedings are more about the system and about structural issues. Yeah, so I think I think we're just at the beginning of this legal revolution that started with the Yugoslavia Tribunal, and then from there, the civil proceedings also developed. Because there's this analog between comparing the issues of responsibility and the principles that between criminal law and civil law are, but there, I shouldn't talk about that, because then I fall in my own.
No, it's another whole podcast. Well, Frederiek, we always just take a kind of small slice. So I won't say thank you for now, but my first additional question is there something that I should have asked you that you wish that I haven't had a chance to ask you yet?
Supporting litigation is our core business. And I still say even though I've left. Okay, but I'm still a senior advisor. I'm very happy to be a part of the network. But when we, for example, in 2015, when the Syrians had to flee Syria and came in big numbers to the Netherlands, and we saw that there are many of our colleagues among the people in the refugee centers, we thought, how can we reach out to them to offer them a legal network to see how we can cooperate, and maybe they're interested in working on investigations or any sort of litigation or other forms of redress, going to the UN, working with the III mechanism, the UN mechanism for Syria that started at that time. So that was good in the sense. I remember very well, it's one of my fondest memories, that in 2016 or so, I think, with a group of around 20 Syrian lawyers who were at that time still in the reception centers all over the Netherlands, we visited the Yugoslavia Tribunal. And that was the first time that there were Syrian lawyers in the tribunal. And we were really proud to bring those two worlds together and have discussions with the prosecutors there. explaining what the prosecutors had done in the context of Bosnia, what humanitarian law involves, war crimes, what they are. I remember also a meeting in Sarajevo between Bosnian prosecutors who, during the war, said, we just started. We didn't know anything about humanitarian law, but we had to. And that was sort of, bringing those groups together, I thought was really worthwhile. So having that network, and out of that network, we see now that the cooperation between us and the prosecutor's office in the Netherlands, working on criminal cases against Syrian war criminals who are here, that makes sense. But it's a sort of the Syria Legal Network became autonomous because we thought that should be autonomous, independent organizations from our foundation, because we focus on these cases, the civil proceedings, on litigation, and there's much more in the Syrian context. So the Syria Legal Network became an independent organization. Very difficult because the group was very fragmented and didn't have a long life, unfortunately, but it's still, the ideas are still alive and there are still activities going on. And I think that's what the Yazidi Legal Network also has, the same background, a little bit more focused on real litigation, making sure that Dutch people who were involved in ISIS activities and ISIS crimes and who are based in the Netherlands are brought to court, before a criminal court. And now last year when we set up the Ukrainian legal network, it's also not so much focused on litigation, much more on how can we assist in a broader sense our colleagues who are now here in very general programs set up either by the Ukrainian government or by the Council of Europe that take care of redress or compensation or reparation as a result of the war. But also with the idea that these networks should be independent and we keep this small organization that's focused on litigation.
And the last question that we always like to ask is there anything you'd like to recommend to those who are listening in the way of books, films, or podcasts? It can be whatever you use to get away from this field or whatever you've been reading that you think would be useful for people in this field.
Well, two books come to my mind. The one I already mentioned, and this is by I forgot her first name, but she's called Litigation, this Canadian anthropologist writing about her family that survived Auschwitz, and who writes about what it means, compensation and victims. It is called, the title of the book is How to Receive German Reparations. And one thing that she says in the beginning of the book, that she was surprised that there is so little study being done and so little written about what it means for victims to receive money from a state that has tried to annihilate you. It's true. I found one other book, but there's very little. The German state spent billions of marks or dollars, or whatever, to victims and are still trying to look for victims that are entitled for compensation. But so little is written. So that book is fantastic. And the other book is called The Radical Lawyer. It was written by the founder of the Center for Constitutional Rights in the US, who started in the 60s with a legal mobilization movement, saying you have to go, if there's discrimination, you have to go to court, start litigation, use the law as a change maker. And you will lose it, if you fight the American government for war crimes in Vietnam or for discrimination in the US, you will lose it. But you put the issues on the agenda, and one day you will win. And it's a fantastic book.
Frederiek, thank you. I know this was done mainly off the cuff and basically in place of me standing and having a glass of wine with you to say goodbye your earlier period at the Nuhanovic Foundation. So thank you for making the time. And I'm sorry I didn't manage to make it there to wish you goodbye and good luck in person. But I'm sure we will chat again.
I hope so. Yes. Well, it was a real pleasure. Thank you.
So, Steph, what's your view on this idea that kind of there's a move now for more universal jurisdiction? We have populations of local lawyers, people from Syria, people from Ukraine who are taking this on board. And as Frederiek said there, the foundation's role has been kind of facilitating that and enabling them also to work with the Dutch prosecution service. What's your view on that?
Well, I know their work with the Yazidis has been really, really instrumental in getting a Dutch Yazidi case going. And I don't think that would have worked without this kind of grassroots lawyers and this organization connecting, who knows the Dutch prosecution service, and connecting this to the victims. Because I think generally in our field, you kind of see a shift also towards trying to get these UJ cases going. And what you need for that is really a kind of go-between who knows the system of the country they're operating in and who also has connections with these lawyers and victims from particular groups. And I think in that sense, it is the right move to get away from. There's only so many civil cases you can bring, and it's a limited kind of accountability. You get some recognition for the victims, maybe you get some reparations or damages, but under the Dutch system, reparations and damages for victims are extremely low. You're never going to get a big dollar payout like you can get in the US. And so maybe the idea of getting justice and getting perpetrators actually convicted is something that you can focus on. And I think that we can see in those Yazidi cases, you have Dutch women who went off to be ISIS brides now being convicted of being complicit in slavery and sexual slavery because they held Yazidi slaves in their home. And that was just a very interesting case to follow, because they were also all blaming their husbands and saying that they didn't have any power. But the judge kind of brushed that aside and said, no, the fact that you are having these slaves essentially take care of your children, you are responsible for that. And I thought that is a good outcome, and you have a different kind of thing to focus on.
Well, I'm sure we'll carry on covering those cases as we keep going.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg, in partnership with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by Autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.